I am Allison Schutte of the English department here at Valparaiso University, and we have a series we call the Wordfest series, so that every year we can bring noted writers to campus and they spend time with our students in classes. Today, Dinty was with us in an editing and publishing class that Marcy Johnson teaches, and he was with my creative nonfiction students. And we can't do this series without the support of the English department and also without the support of the Cultural Arts Committee. So we really appreciate their financial support of this program. Tonight's event, a number of my students are out there, so they've heard this before, is a special event for us. It's the first time we tried it, and we invited alumni to read Dinty's book alongside of us. And then, because of that, we wanted to do something more than just have a reading. We wanted to spend some time initially here just asking Dinty some questions about writing, about the book. So the way that the program will go tonight is we'll spend the first 20 minutes just asking some questions, having a conversation with Dinty up here, and then we will move to the actual reading. That will be followed by a book signing and a reception in the lobby afterwards. And the bookstore is out there. They have a table, so if you don't have a book yet, you can still buy one. And we will set Dinty up at that table as well, so that you can have your book signed by him. There will be lots of food. I noticed they put it sort of on the far end of the lobby, so you have to walk for it, but maybe that will make you more hungry, so you'll be ready to take more away with you. So I hope that you will help yourself to the refreshments afterwards as well. And any alumni that are here, we really are pleased to have you here. And anybody from the public, we're really excited to have you with us as well. And we would love to know if this is something you would like to see happen more as well. So you can talk to me afterwards if you have any feedback for us. So I'm going to turn it over now to Hannah Bauer, who's one of our senior writing students, and she will introduce Dinty for us.
So when I first heard that writers actually choose to write nonfiction, I was kind of astounded. I thought that for sure nonfiction only meant textbooks and biographies, but Dinty Moore demonstrates exactly the opposite. His unconventional memoir, Between Panic and Desire, tells his story through a series of personal essays, quizzes, definitions, and even a made-for-TV docudrama script. This post-Nixon, post-panic, post-modern, and post-mortem collection discusses relatable themes such as family life, fear, desire, and American culture and politics. It surprised me to find out that nonfiction can be just as enticing and interesting as fiction, when explored in such a variety of forms and topics. Moore is also dedicated to sharing his gift through teaching both undergraduate and graduate students at Ohio University's Creative Writing program. He is also author to numerous publications which focus on the development of writers. Such publications include The Mindful Writer, Noble Truths of the Writing Life, and Crafting the Personal Essay, a guide for writing and publishing creative nonfiction. Another way our guest speaker for today explores the genre of creative nonfiction is through his position as editor for the online literary journal Brevity, a journal of concise literary nonfiction. As one of the first creative nonfiction journals, Brevity publishes flash nonfiction essays of 750 words or less. The magazine not only publishes up-and-coming authors, but also authors recognized both nationally and internationally. So tonight we have the honor of being Mr. Moore's students as we gather around to ask him some questions about his craft, and as well to hear him read from the 2009 Grub Street National Book Award, which is also his most recent work of creative nonfiction, Between Panic and Desire. Please join me in welcoming Dinty Moore.
Thank you. That's very nice.
So Dinty, what draws you to the genre of creative nonfiction?
A number of things, really. I think the genre is very flexible. It includes memoir, writing about the past, and exploring the meaning of what happened in your life. It includes a little bit of journalism, literary journalism. It's different than standard journalism because whereas at least in the old-fashioned standard journalism, the author was supposed to be absent and everything was sort of objective. And under creative nonfiction, literary journalism, the author is very present. Whatever interests him, or whatever her passions are, or whatever the author is obsessed with, becomes as much a part of the story as anything else. And it also includes the personal essay tradition, which goes back hundreds of years, where the movement of the author's mind or the author's thoughts and concerns, it goes back to Saint Augustine, if not earlier. It includes that. So there's a great flexibility of what you can do in creative nonfiction. It has to be honest, it has to be truthful within the difficult boundaries of memory. But within that, you can do so many different things and tell so many different stories, so many different ways. Plus, people like to read it. So, there's a hunger out there for good stories.
Do you have any insights on that? Like why the genre has become something that people seem to seek out?
I don't know. I go back and forth. The idea of writing nonfiction, true stories that happened or that you observed, that you've researched. It goes back to the Greek orders. It goes back to St. Augustine in France in the 1700s. There was a fellow named Montaigne who started the essay movement. Orwell did it. Virginia Woolf did it. So I'm not even sure there is more of it. I think what might have happened more recently in the last 20 years or so is it began to be defined. The academics, whose job it is to sort of do a taxonomy and label things, came up with this term, creative nonfiction, began to be taught they pulled together a lot of types of writing that were happening anyway, and have been happening, like I said, as long as people have been telling stories, and started to define it as a genre of writing right alongside fiction or poetry. Previous to that, people who wrote nonfiction didn't know where they were. Some of them were journalists, some of them were essayists. People didn't really know what to make of the genre. So it's a definition thing, I think.
Are there a lot of opportunities that creative nonfiction authors have that fiction writers don't?
No, and it's not. I want to make it very clear, it's not a competition. I think fiction is a wonderful genre, and thank goodness there are people out there writing fiction. I think poetry is a wonderful genre. We need informational nonfiction, people who write nonfiction that's basically presenting information on history or information on science or technology, but the more personal-based nonfiction. Personal-based is a mouthful, so I'm glad they didn't call it that, but creative nonfiction is kind of personal-based. It's the author's take on the world or the subject. The only advantage really is there are literary magazines, small literary magazines that publish it, larger literary magazines that publish it, the glossier and more well-established magazines like Harper's and The Atlantic and The New Yorker and Sunday New York Times Magazine. They're interested in this work. Whereas it seems like the market for poetry is getting smaller and smaller as time moves forward. The market for well-written nonfiction that has a point of view, that has the author's concerns and persona embedded in the work, the market for it seems to be getting wider.
But what about the place of imagination? Fiction, by definition, seems to include your story can come from anywhere. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily true for creative nonfiction. So if that seems like a restriction, does it also bring with it opportunity, either for the reader or for the writer?
Well, I think people read something differently when they know it's true. There's a truth and an answer you find in fiction, but when you're reading fiction and you understand that the author has created this and created these opportunities and created these characters, I think readers, there's something different at stake. It's wonderful. I'm not trying to suggest one is better than the other, but it's a different kind of experience to read fiction and know that you get caught up in it sometimes and it seems so real, but in the back of your head you know that this is the author's imagination and it's an exercise in what if. When you're reading really compelling nonfiction and you know that the people being described are real and the events that happen to these people are real, and in many cases it's the author himself or herself that is at the center of it, but not always. I think it's a different experience for the reader because there's something different at stake. It's like this really did occur. I mean, so on one level, that's what nonfiction brings to the table. There's a lot of criticism of memoir, and people have different disparaging names for it, the memoir, or the tragic victim memoir. But actually, I will, and there's some badly written books in nonfiction, just as there are badly written books and stories in any genre. But I'll support the memoir genre because I think it's what has happened in the last 50 years when many, many more people started telling their stories, whether it's growing up in rural poverty, growing up as an outsider, gay, or of a different race in a community where you were not accepted, whether it has to do with spousal abuse, childhood abuse. You can take pot shots at people for telling these stories, but when they're told well, they are very compelling stories. But more importantly, I think they've done, I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a minute, but they've done well for the world. I mean, there are people out there, whether they're in an abusive situation or an outsider situation, who thought they were the only person, who thought that there was something wrong with them, who thought they had been singled out by the universe to feel these bad thoughts or feel this shame, or to be bullied, who when people share their stories, and there's other ways of sharing, but this kind of writing is one. When people share these stories, people realize, oh my goodness, there's a lot of this going on, and it's not just me, and they start thinking about it in different ways. And I think there's something, I don't think the primary purpose of writing is healing. I think the primary purpose of writing is art, to try to reveal and reflect on the truth and make some sense of the human experience. But there is a sense that it is healing for people to reveal their stories. So people who make fun of the memoir genre, they can make fun of it, but I think in the end it's done a lot more good than the harm that's been done by a couple of not so well written books.
You wrote that this is not just your memoir, but a memoir for a certain time period in America. So what responsibilities come along with writing and or speaking for others?
I'll say not much, because what I love about the nonfiction genre, the creative nonfiction genre, the sort of quirky memoir that I wrote is I'm asking questions. I'm saying it felt like this to me. I wonder if it felt like this to other people. I talk a lot about growing up during the Nixon times and the paranoia that Watergate, back to back with Vietnam, sort of instilled in people of my age, 40, 50, people who are 40 or 50 years old now. I talk a lot about the other historical events, going all the way up to 9/11, but I focus mainly on my younger years, including the Beatles and Manson and all this sort of stuff. And I'm really just asking questions about how did this affect me, and how does this affect how I view the world, and how does this affect perhaps how everyone who grew up in that time views the world. So I'm not really laying claim that I'm sure, or that I'm right, or that I'm discovered. It's not a science, it's not a work of science where I've proven my point. And this is what I love about, art does this generally, but it's what I love about nonfiction writing, is I'm asking questions and I'm wondering, does it feel this way to other people? Are these things connected? And if I'm wrong, well, maybe I entertained you for a few pages while I was wrong. But if I was writing hard science, I'd be much more worried about the responsibility to get to reach the correct conclusion. So it's a book, most of my writing, but the book you're asking me about, Between Panic and Desire, is a book full of questions and possible answers, thinking out loud on the page about what the answers might be. But I'm still learning stuff, which is fun.
All right, well, in Between Panic and Desire, you expose, yourself and your family in a number of ways, addiction, dysfunctional relationships. So how do you put yourself out there for your authors, or for your readers?
Yeah, I have a thick skin, I guess. I don't take myself too seriously, nor do I think that I've done wonderful, smart things my entire life. Nor do I think that I have to pretend I've done wonderful, smart things my entire life. I've made dumb mistakes like most everybody I've met, and people I meet who haven't made dumb mistakes I either worry about them or I don't believe them. I mean, life is difficult. So I don't think there's any shame in saying, I did some dumb things, but my heart was in the right place, and I'm trying to do it better now. So, I mean, I guess my answer is, it's sort of my attitude is, well, so what? I screwed up when I was 20, or I did something really stupid when I was 25, or I hadn't really figured out life when I was 30. I'm 56. I haven't figured out life yet. I don't know that I ever will. I doubt that I ever will.
What about the family piece of it, when you do include family stories?
My father was a very heavy drinker. And this is nothing new. There's a lot of stories like this, but he was of the town drunk variety, where he would wander home late at night. He went out drinking just literally every night, it seems, of my childhood. He sobered up very near the end of his life, but he didn't live much longer after that. But he would come home from the bars so drunk that he would wander into the neighbor's house, and it was such a common occurrence. They would call and say, "Your father's here. You better come get him." So I read about that some. It turns out my mother was more of a quiet addict, depressive, and taking pills, which I didn't realize at the time, but realized much later in life. So I love them, and I love both of them. I love their memories. I know that they were trying to do the right thing, but they had their own tragedies in their life, and I think it's important to tell the truth about stories like that. So I did. I mean, I didn't exaggerate. I didn't try to hurt anybody, but I didn't hide anything either. It was, again, I don't pretend. A lot of people out there had a lot of tough childhoods, and a lot of people had tougher childhoods than I did. This is just my story, and if you can't be honest about it, then you can't really be honest on the page about anything.
You use a variety of forms in between Panic and Desire, and I thought that it makes it a really good book for aspiring writers. It gives them some different forms to experiment with. How do you come up with inventive forms like this?
How do I come up with different forms or invented ways of telling a true story? Trial and error. I like playing around with different ways to present a story. There's stories in true stories in that book that are Zen koans. There's one that's sort of an abecedarian, sort of an alphabetical order catalog of events. There's a story I think you mentioned in the introduction. There's a story that's a made-for-TV movie script. I think I won't overcomplicate it. I think I was playing around. I was playing around saying, what happens when you do this? What happens when you do that? This is interesting. Even though I write about serious things, my work is often comic, so I think there's comic possibilities in subverting or flip-flopping the reader's expectations or the reader's experience. But I like to play. I like to play a lot on the page and play with form and play with metaphor and play with language. So I think that's just all part of it.
Does that mean that you often start with the form and
No,
write
I usually
into
don't.
it?
I often don't. It goes both ways. A couple times I've said, okay, I'm going to try to write a story, but it's going to be in this form. A countdown from 20 to 1 or something. But in many cases, especially in the book that you guys are asking me about, the essay started out one way, and somewhere in the middle of the composing process, I do many drafts. I like to revise and then walk away and think about it a while, and then come back and revise again, and then hide it in a drawer, and then pull it out a week later and say, what is this thing? What can I do to it to make it interesting? Often the form came out of the content that way, that I discovered it as I was, not necessarily as I was doing the first draft, but as I was doing the fifth draft and pulling out my hair and saying, well, what is this? What are you writing about here? Why would you ever show this to anybody? It's a mess.
Well, that actually might be a perfect segue into the reading. You can test out the mess on us and see what we think. So thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom with us, and we'll let you take the podium.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank the students that I met in Marcy Johnson's class, Allison Schuette's class, and I met from the literary magazine today for being very welcoming to me and very pleasant and asking me some good questions. And thank you for this introduction and the questions you asked me just now. I apologize, there might have been some false advertising. I'm not reading from the book Between Panic and Desire tonight. I'm reading some newer work, but it's actually in the spirit. And those of you who've read the book, well, then you get to hear something new. And I'm going to read about something that probably runs about 20 minutes, and then I'll take a deep breath and I'll read something somewhat shorter, and then we can find out if the food is really as good as advertised. But for those of you wondering how long this is going to go, we'll keep it in reasonable limits. There's not a whole lot of introduction to this piece. I think it's pretty clear straight through, except as I believe I said in the nice dialogue that just took place, I sometimes use humor to write about serious things, and this essay is in many ways about that, and it's entitled Oxymoron. 3 things. Bullethead is barely through the door, but already I'm trying to preserve his precious time. He's a doctor, and surely someone in the lobby is sick and needs immediate attention. Okay, 3 things, he echoes, pulling up a stool and quickly scanning my chart. Bullethead is not his real name, of course, not on his medical school diploma, certainly. But the man's head is smooth, round, bald as a bullet, and he's an ex-Marine, so there's no nonsense here, no unnecessary compassion. He has a ballistic precision. I like it that way. And I'm not the only one who uses this nickname behind his back. So I dangle on the edge of the examination table. Bullethead shuffles some papers, and we spend 30 seconds agreeing that the uncomfortable side effects of my prostate medication are dreadful, but probably unavoidable. He throws around a few Latinate words and scribbles illegibly in my chart. So what else? He asks. I lift and angle my arm to display a patch on my left elbow, leathery like an old baseball mitt, the skin beginning to dry out and scale off. I wouldn't waste his time with something so inconsequential, but my wife is convinced that I'm developing skin cancer. The patch on my elbow shows none of the classic characteristics of skin cancer, other than being on my skin. But Renita's family prides itself on having raised anxiety to an aesthetic level. Bullethead scrawls a prescription for eczema cream. Now, what's third, he asks. We've been locked in the room together for almost 2 full minutes, and both of us are itchy to end the thing. I've been having a flutter. I point to the center of my chest, right here for, maybe 3 weeks. Dr. B's pen halts in mid-scribble. He raises his eyebrows, etching deep wrinkles into his wide forehead, and then leans back on the stool as if to get a better look at this fool sitting before him. He needs to savor the moment, perhaps, so that later, when he meets his doctor buddies at the country club and he gets them howling over stories of his dim-witted patient, he will have every detail correct. A flutter. Yeah. You tell me this third. Yeah. You didn't tell me this when I walked in the door. I offer a shrug, a sort of I don't know hand gesture, and a feeble smile. You didn't think this was important. He has me there, so I do nothing. The doctor shakes his head, gets to his feet. You should be beaten. That to me is a funny moment because Bullethead is a witty guy, and his spur-of-the-moment response here has all the spontaneity and surprise required of a good joke. Moreover, the moment includes the sublime reversal essential to good comedy, the idea of a physician, a healing professional, beating some poor guy just about the moment he goes into cardiac arrest is swollen with the sweet juices of irony. And finally, there is subtext. The entire moment, but especially Bullethead's frustrated final response, speaks volumes about men and medicine, about all the thousands upon thousands of foolhardy masculine stoics before me who went to their early graves feeling pretty darn good about themselves, because after all, they weren't whiny little weaklings who crawled to the doctor with every trivial complaint. They knew how to suck it up. The more you analyze a joke, of course, the more you squeeze all of the funny out of it. But I'm trying to make a point about dark humor and irreverence, about the ability to laugh at grave matters. My mother knew a thing or two about dark humor. She lost her father when she was in kindergarten, a suicide. They say he jumped in front of a New York City subway, distraught over family trouble. She lost her mother only a few years later. No one ever discusses the reason for that loss. My mother had to be tough. Life gave her no other good choices. She had this phrase she would repeat, almost like a mantra, during the worst of times. "They can kick me in the teeth," she would say, "but they'll never make me cry." Mom never specified who she meant by the pronoun they, and I never asked. I guess I always knew. Her parents. Her father's Chicago relatives who seemed to lose interest in her for the most part after the death of her father. Her first husband, my dad. Her second husband, a truly lousy man. Her children, often ungrateful. The various employers who did not take her skills seriously because she was female or young or both. And anyone else who threatened the slender thread of security she was able to create for herself after the devastating loss of both parents. Part of my mother's toughness, we called it Irish humor, but in truth, it seems to cross ethnicities, was to laugh at anything fearlessly, to say the worst with a wink, to lampoon even the most sacred or startling human moments. For instance, cardiac malfunction. Bullethead in the end neither beats me nor has me beaten. It is worse. He has me stripped, gelled, wired, and graphed. The next 15 minutes of my no longer routine doctor's visit feels to me as if someone has flipped the fast forward button on the overhead observation camera aimed at my life. Bullethead slides quickly out the door, barks coded instructions. The nurses halt in mid-step, pivot on cue. Within moments, Noreen is in the exam room. My shirt is off, the table is adjusted. I'm on my back, and Karen arrives with a cart. Some sort of liquid gel is gooped onto my chest, and now another nurse is in the room, disentangling wires quickly, efficiently, magically. And before you can say flatline, I'm all hooked up, back, chest, neck, and arms. This won't hurt until we pull them off, Karen promises. The machine on the cart is booted up, and for a moment we all enjoy a brief symphony of initial beeps and squawks. Then quick as that, everyone leaves. They leave. I'm rather surprised given the gravity of what seems to be underway. I had, after all, always thought that the responsibility of modern medicine was to keep us alive, not simply to record the inevitable endpoint for posterity. Cripes Yemeni, Mrs. Moore. We're just so sorry about your husband taking his last gasp in the examination room just now. I imagine one of these nurses telling my wife when she comes to claim the body. But look, you can see on this printout where it wasn't our fault. See that big splotch of ink? He pretty much exploded right there. You want this for your wall or something? Now understand, I had no premonition that I was about to expire until they hooked me up. But right then everything changed. This seemed real, you know, like television is real, like ER or House. The serious machinery, the urgency of the usually wise-cracking nurses, the look on Bullethead's typically impassive face, all combined to persuade me that my end time was, well, maybe not inevitable, but now vaguely possible. For 5 minutes or so, I'm on my back alone in the room, wondering what the machine is saying about me. The door is open so the nurses at the central station can hear if I drop off the table or something. But otherwise I'm forgotten, or at least seem to be. All I can focus on is the music. This is a modern medical practice, high tech, with multiple physicians, housed in a sparkling new suite of offices. And every hallway is wired to play a stream of classic rock. Most of the time you aren't even aware of it, but right now I am. I'm hearing it like I've never heard it before. And Elton John is singing, "Don't let the sun go down on me. Don't let the sun." And I laugh out loud, kind of an awkward chortle, with more volume than intended, because it is hard to produce a natural laugh when you are flat on your back, attached to 14 wires, trying to keep your heart from blowing to smithereens. I chortle, gack a little bit, and the nurse sticks her head in the door at an angle where I can't quite see her, but can hear her voice. "Everybody okay in here?" she asks. Now that was funny too, to me at least. The fact that I should hear this ultra-sappy Elton John ballad about the sun going down at the very moment that it seemed that my own metaphorical life-giving ball of light might finally be plummeting into the metaphorical dark black sea. Even at that moment, I see the humor, which, by the way, drives my wife insane. Renita, the exquisitely anxious, the one who imagines that a dry patch of skin on my elbow is cancer, that a weekend cough is viral pneumonia, that the unexpected sound of me dropping a hardcover book onto the wooden floor of our second-floor bedroom is actually me dropping to the floor dead as a stump. Simply can't see the humor in any of this. In her family, first and second generation Italian Catholic, from the hard-scrabble, agricultural Abruzze region, you don't joke about death. You don't, in fact, ever even mention death. And for that matter, you don't dare refer to any of the countless maladies that might lead to death. Yet at the same time, you anticipate disaster with every fretful cell in your body. God forbid is their ancestral mantra. When one of my wife's relatives needs to see a doctor, the family goes into serious mourning well before the test results. The worst fears, cancer, heart failure, anything potentially fatal, are never named out of an innate belief that the mere naming of a dreadful consequence will bring it raining down upon the victim. Don't say it, the great aunts remind one another while crossing themselves. God forbid. Of course, age and provenance play a role here. Renita's extended family, particularly those of her grandparents' generation, consisted primarily of first and second generation immigrants. It wasn't really so long ago that Europe experienced back-to-back world wars. Infant mortality and death in childbirth were tragically common. Penicillin was non-existent. It was a hard life. But even, it seems, as the reality softened, the fear and anxiety did not. I can remember one delight-filled August afternoon when our daughter and her 4 girl cousins were in their grandparents' side yard, chasing one another, laughing, running, wielding sticks, small branches from a nearby maple. I looked out the dining room window and saw the innocent joy of youth and summer. My mother-in-law, Lucy, on the other hand, looked out the same window, saw the same children running with thin branches of green maple, and said nervously to no one in particular, "Oh, I can just imagine one of them getting an eye poked out." And she could. She really could. Vividly. God forbid. Given all of the tragedy and disappointment in her life, you might expect that my mother would have also been prone to expect the worst imaginable circumstances, but so often she did not. She had a silly optimistic side at times, what seemed like a schoolgirl's belief that no matter how badly entangled life's difficulties had become, a fresh day and new sunshine would somehow sort it all out. Unfortunately, such thinking led her into both her marriages. Neither of them was a particularly good idea, though I am thankful for the first. As for death, she seemed never to even think about it. My sisters and I spent 20 frustrating years suggesting that Mom write out a simple will, one that would cover various end-of-life one that would cover various end-of-life issues and clarify her wishes for burial. Mom spent 20 years promising that she would, when the time came. There is a delicious lack of logic in that position, since under a fair number of conceivable scenarios, she would be dead when the time came, and thus couldn't clarify anything. But contrariness was at the very heart of her personality. It occurs to me, of course, that waiting until the time came was perhaps her version of death anxiety, a different sort of old-world superstition from that practiced by my wife's fear-ridden Italian grandmothers, but nonetheless serving the same purpose. The lack of a will, the absence of any planning or acknowledgement, meant my mother wasn't ready. And if she wasn't ready, well then, clearly she couldn't go. The fear of all things related to mortality has a name, thanatophobia. Freud was one of the first to study the matter, theorizing that people who exhibit immense concern about their own passing aren't really worried about death per se, but are instead obsessing over unresolved childhood conflicts, no doubt sexual in nature. Freud, of course, saw sex in everything. Ernest Becker in 1973 finally took Freud's problematic theory and turned it entirely inside out, positing that death itself was the root of all fear. Becker asserted not only that thanatophobia was entirely real, but that many of our other obsessive fears are substitutes for our primary dread of the unknown end. Take claustrophobia, for instance, fear of burial. Or consider those of us with the compulsive need to constantly surround ourselves with friends, music, bright lights, and laughter. In the latter case, Becker suggests, our death anxiety creates the forceful need to remind ourselves that we are still alive. Even obsessive-compulsive disorder, hypochondria, and various eating disorders can be linked to death anxiety. These diseases are each in their own way about controlling what happens to us, or to our bodies at least. Perhaps because we cannot be in command of the one thing we wish to conquer, death, and what happens afterwards. My heart rate was mildly elevated, but nothing serious showed up on the EKG that day, Elton John's sad lament notwithstanding. Bullethead scratched his hairless scalp, gave me another disapproving look, and suggested, well, there's something wrong with you, as if that weren't obvious to everyone who'd ever met me. He scheduled more tests to get to the bottom of this for 2 weeks hence, but I never made it. About a week later, I was shoveling early morning snow in the driveway, heavy, wet snow that was piling up above my knees, and I began to feel lightheaded. Worse, I began to feel confused, forgetful. It was a strange sensation, like the disorientation that comes with a high fever, but I wasn't running a fever as best I could tell. While outside shoveling, I felt distinctly as if I was forgetting something important that I needed to do inside the house. So I would go back inside, but once inside, I wouldn't remember at all what I was looking for. So I would go outside again, shovel a bit more. It made no sense then, and doesn't seem to make much sense even now. My arms ached a little, but maybe that was from the shoveling. I was ready to imagine something worse, however, so I went inside, roused my sleeping wife, and suggested that I had better go see the doctor that morning. She was plenty concerned, but when I added, "And honey, maybe you should drive instead of me," she turned white. Even that day, though, I couldn't sustain the mood. My regular doctor was off, out sick in fact, which someone else might have taken as a bad omen. Instead, I joked with the nurse that if I was to die, if this were in fact my day to cash in all the chips, she should make sure Bullethead felt plenty guilty. Tell him I lost all hope when I learned he wasn't going to be here. I remember her giving me a very odd look. The new doctor listened to my symptoms a moment or two, and then ordered me right to the emergency room. You've heard these emergency room stories before, surely. I would have been in safer hands if the doctor ordered me immediately to the local Red Lobster. The ER was an overcrowded muddle. The individual patient rooms, actually not rooms, but cubicles, marked off with thin curtains, were full. So the hallways were cluttered with gurneys scattered every which way, and the gurneys were occupied by a ragtag army of elderly gentlemen, many of them sound asleep. I was placed up against a random curtain, hooked into the central monitoring system, and pretty much ignored. Every 30 minutes or so at first, a nurse would walk by, take my pulse, and promise that they were looking to find me a room in the cardiac unit. But cardiac is pretty booked, they would tell me. There are 12 of you down here. Like I said, it was a heavy, wet snow, a heart attack machine. This still looking for a bed routine went on for 4 miserable hours, until the nurses just stopped apologizing, or even mentioning that I might ever be released from my hideous purgatory. Around 8 p.m., 6 hours into my ER visit, I finally sent my wife home. Our daughter had homework to do, My heart rate had been holding steady for hours, and I didn't even feel so bad anymore, just annoyed. I clearly wasn't dying. And frankly, you can only meaningfully squeeze your spouse's hand so many times before it starts to hurt. Despite not being ready until the time came, my mom, at the age of 86, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the first significant illness of her long life, and was told that she had, best case, 6 months to live. My sisters and I were with her when the oncologist explained the facts and timing, and that afternoon at least, none of us found much to laugh about. My mom, though, true to form, took barely 24 hours to seemingly put all thoughts of death and the sadness right out of her mind. "How are you feeling?" I asked my mother on the phone later in the week. "Is there anything you want to talk about?" She acted surprised by my question, as if she had no idea to what I was referring. Why would I? There was a long silence, and then I stuttered, "Well, you had some pretty big news just recently." "Oh, that," she answered quickly. "I'm not even thinking about that." Mom took the next few months as an opportunity to revel in sudden visits from nieces and nephews. She focused her energies on determining who would get each of the many knickknacks she had bought for under $1 at some yard sale. If I said yes to some item, she would write my name on a piece of masking tape and attach it to the bottom. Her biggest worry, it would seem, from an outsider's perspective, was not what happens to the human soul beyond death, but what happens to the human soul's Pyrex dishware. I don't want to oversimplify here. Whatever was unspoken by my mother, and she was a woman who always kept her deepest thoughts most private, I'll never know. But she did at times seem almost relieved to know exactly how she would die, and pretty much when. Even in the final 2 months, bedridden and losing weight at an alarming pace, she mostly avoided the ramifications of her condition and instead looked again and again for ways to soften the mood. I remember her waking one day from a fevered sleep, calling into my sister from the bedroom, "Come on now, Susie, this will be over and done with. Lighten up a little." Some of her non sequiturs, insisting, for instance, that the nuns who came by every day were not Benedictines but Klondikes, may have been due to the powerful painkiller, OxyContin. But some of it, I'm convinced, was her drive to find the humor in everything, a drive I seem to have inherited. She eventually took to calling the painkiller my oxymoron, and soon enough, even the hospice nurses began to call it that as well. When a very elderly Father Carter came to my mother's apartment to administer the last rites, my mother once again managed the final laugh. She had been in and out of a comatose sleep for days at this point, but would occasionally revive and sometimes seem highly animated. Father Carter was doing his best, but his hands were shaky, his eyesight poor, and at a key moment in the solemn Roman Catholic sacrament, he called my mother by the wrong name. "Oh," my mom responded quite loudly, "that old priest." We all flinched, startled to hear her speak, to see her so suddenly awake and so lucid. "Don't anyone worry about that old Father Carter," she whispered. "That man hasn't been all there for years." With that, my mom turned to my sister, standing in tears at the foot of the bed, waved and smiled, as if we had all just enjoyed the most amusing moment of this whole end-of-life adventure. Perhaps we had. 2 days later, she was gone. Which proves what? Nothing, maybe. You can have death anxiety, or you can not have death anxiety, and it always ends the same way. My medical chart, the morning after the emergency room visit for chest flutter and dizziness, proved nothing as well. By every measure, stress test, ultrasound, MRI, my heart was pumping along just fine, my arteries were clear, and there was no need to bill my insurance for another minute of hospital time. Other than the slim possibility that I was reacting poorly to a new allergy medication, I don't to this day know what my ticker was trying to tell me. Maybe a warning shot over the bow. Laughing in the face of death is perhaps an oxymoron, like my mother's painkiller, like the term mercy killing or a full life, or almost certain. But I'm almost certain of this. The incessant wringing of hands, anticipation of death, worrying about what comes afterwards, thanatophobia, serves very little purpose except to make us faintly miserable, when we should, at the very least, be reveling in the simple fact that we are, for the moment, alive. What I tell my wife, and sometimes she laughs, sometimes she doesn't, is that she'll die of stress long before I die of being an overweight, beer-guzzling white male. I'll waddle into the bedroom one night, trailing potato chip crumbs, and she will have worried herself into an early grave. God forbid. Or maybe I should be careful and not say such a thing. I mean, what if I was wrong? What if I keeled over 3 weeks after finishing this reading? Or sooner? How stupid would I look then? Pretty stupid, except the joke's on you. I wouldn't care, because of this. I'd be dead. Thank you. One more short piece. I'm okay. Thank you. The young ladies were asking me about different forms, different ways of shaping a story, a true story. And this is one of them. I think the form will become very clear very soon after I start reading. The scientific facts are all accurate. I had to do a bit of research and was sort of surprised to learn what I learned about the teenage stage of human life. How many people out here were ever female teenagers? How many people out here ever raised a female teenager? Well, I dedicated, that's all but 3 people. So I dedicate it to all of you. Feel very special. I'm going to dedicate it to you. The essay is entitled Pulling Teeth, or 20 Reasons Why My Daughter Turning 20 Can't Come Soon Enough. 1. Here's an interesting fact. Homo erectus, our 1.5 million year old evolutionary antecedent, skipped right over the teenage years, proceeding directly from cave kid to cave adult. 2. Researchers figured this out by taking cross-sections of fossilized teeth. Markings on tooth enamel, it turns out, are much like tree rings. They tell us, for instance, that what modern human parents experience as an extended, oftentimes interminable period of adolescence only developed about 500,000 years ago. 3. Our ancestors were, in this way, like modern apes. Young apes tend to break the apron strings much earlier than humans. By the time a female chimpanzee has reached her early teen years, she can make her own nest and locate her own bananas. 4. More importantly, if a day filled with grooming her simian cousins, gnawing on twigs, and swinging from branch to branch to attract boy chimps, leaves a female teen chimp feeling somehow unfulfilled, she doesn't blame anyone but herself. 5. My point? Someone should yank the teeth out of every teenage boy in my daughter's high school classroom. I have names and addresses if any scientists are in the audience. 6. My other point. Those same scientists should pull gently a few girl molars as well and put these female teeth under a microscope. My hope here is that these molarologists will discover that some invisible change is already underway. After all, if teenagers can evolve once, they can surely evolve again. Perhaps evolve to some point where this prickly adolescent stage becomes once again entirely unnecessary. 7. I have a female teenager at home. The other day I picked up a piece of paper on the table next to my favorite chair. "Don't look at that," my female teenager shouted. So I quickly returned the paper to the desk and murmured, "Sorry, I didn't know it was private." She huffed. "Of course it's private." What I seemed to be looking at in the few short moments before I was bullied into putting it back down was a line drawing of a young woman in a dress. I think the point of the artwork was the dress, an elaborate original bit of haute couture. The design, by the way, was drawn on my tablet with my pencil. How was I to know the drawing was private, I asked, foolishly trying to remain in my daughter's good graces. My female teenager just glared at me, the way teenagers will glare when you have them dead to rights, when they know you're correct and they hate you for it. Listen, she said firmly. From now on, just assume that everything I do is private. 8. I am not a perfect father. Instead, I'm the hang-in-there type, meaning that I have almost no idea what I am doing, but over the years I've hung in there, plugging onward, trusting that instinct, or perhaps just dumb luck, will get me through. Female teenagers, of course, naturally crave a level of distance from their embarrassing, fragrant, loutish fathers. So lately I've given my daughter extra space. Girls, after all, have the right to privacy. And here, then, is the rub. That space quickly begins to seem a distance, and that distance soon enough resembles a gulf. Before you know it, neither party can step across. 9. Down this road are any number of horrible outcomes. I know. I've imagined them all. 10. I had the good fortune to take my female teenager to Madrid last summer. Now, admittedly, Madrid in July includes surly crowds, fearsome traffic, and scorching pavement. But still, come on, this was Europe, the capital of Spain. Museums, cafes, fashion. My female teenager just moped for most of the trip, primarily because her feet hurt, and she didn't take well to Spanish cuisine. Why aren't you having fun? I inquired. This is an absolutely brainless question to ask someone who seems not to be having fun, but I asked it nonetheless, more than once. Jesus Christ, she answered, get over it. I persisted, stupidly imagining that I could somehow talk my daughter out of her bad humor. You know, I said in a calm parental voice, it's hard for me to have a good time when I look over and you just seem so darned miserable. She chewed on my words a moment, gave them careful consideration. Then she looked up, met my eye, said, that's your problem. 11. That is my problem. 12. I wish someone had taken me to Europe when I was young. 13. That's my problem too. 14. But I don't know what she wants, or what I'm supposed to do. How do I remain a constructive influence on my teenage female human while being systematically frozen out of every aspect of her teenage female life? How do I please someone who resents my very existence? How do I parent someone whose only wish is that I go far, far away? How do I continue in the face of that? How do I stop trying? Parents, especially embarrassing male parents, can be a drag sometimes, but they are a biological necessity. And as much as I'd like to apologize to my female teenager for the inconvenient reality of sperm and egg and family, it is not my fault. Not really. I'm not the one who came up with it. 15. Charles Darwin had 10 children, but interestingly, he didn't take any of them along to the islands. 16. Which brings me back to the teeth and evolution. Maybe, just maybe, this evolution is continuing even now. And maybe female teenagers are developing beyond this tendency toward difficult unreasonableness. Perhaps this whole problem will be remembered as just a 500,000-year aberration, a necessary but ridiculous step along the evolutionary continuum. 17. Or possibly, like those Galapagos finches that Darwin was so fond of, parents themselves will come to adapt new beaks, allowing them to break open this tougher seed coating. 18. As for my daughter, she will stop being a teenager eventually. She will turn 20. I've heard that can happen. 19. For now, though, just getting my female teenager to speak to me is like pulling teeth. 20. And I don't like pulling teeth. It tends to be painful on both ends. Thank you.